Now it's actually my honor to introduce the keynote speaker for today, Dr. Sachin Jain. Knights, knaves, or pawns? When Dr. Jain challenged doctors to ask how their profession is perceived, he really touched a nerve. Are we knaves whose own self-interests are more important than those of our patients? Are we pawns trapped in a faulty system not of our own making? Dr. Jain wants us to believe, and I think I do, that if we're knights, and he's been spending his career this far proving that doctors actually can be responsible stewards who, quote, organize and structure care delivery, responsibly use resources, and measure and improve individual and population outcomes. When Dr. Jain isn't working as the Chief Medical Information and Innovation Officer at Merck, you might find him at the Boston VA Medical Center, where he's an attending hospitalist physician. Or he might be giving a lecture on health policy at Harvard. He's the founder of several nonprofit healthcare ventures, including the Homeless Health Clinic at Harvard Square Homeless Shelter, the Harvard Bone Marrow Initiative, and the improvehealthcare.org, which provides online advice about medications to consumers. And before joining Merck, Dr. Jain was a senior advisor to the administration at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, where he helped launch the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. By the way, you should go back and tell them to fund our $60 million CMMI grant. Dr. Jain is a graduate of Harvard College, where he also got his medical degree and MBA. He's written more than 50 articles on healthcare delivery, innovation, and healthcare reform, served as a consultant to the World Health Organization. He's the co-founder of the journal Healthcare, the Journal of Delivery Science and Innovation, which I see some of you reading. All of this makes me feel like a slacker, especially when I learned that he was in nursery school in 1984. Go ahead, you can do the math. The work Dr. Jain has done and the changes he advocates are those required for our demonstration project to succeed. As he wrote, clinical training more than ever must take on a population health orientation and prepare students for clinical and managerial focus. Without a significant change in our profession's focus, our best efforts to improve care will fall short. Please welcome Dr. Jain. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that introduction. You now know that I'm not going to be talking about chess as it relates to knights, knaves, and pawns, but instead a topic that's a little bit more challenging to really take on, which I think is the soul of our profession. And actually, speaking about it makes me a little bit nervous because I'm not going to be sort of presenting you with data or slides like I might in some of the other venues in which I speak, but instead I'm going to be talking with you about my own personal journey, what led me to medicine as a profession, and what I view as really the identity crisis that we as a profession have really taken on. Todd Park, one of my colleagues from the federal government, he's the White House Chief Technology Officer, is really known for saying that this is right now the best time to be an innovator in healthcare. And that's a nice euphemism for saying it's a bloody mess. We have the HITECH Act, you have the ACA, you have a growing number of regulations that really govern our profession. And I think within all of that is an incredible opportunity for us to really reshape the public imagination around what the role is of the medical profession, what the role is of the physician, what the role is of the primary care doctor. And so I'd like to hopefully engage with you about some of my perspectives on this, as well as really engage in some dialogue with you about how we as a profession can really reshape the image of the role of the physician in the public imagination. So now that my nursery school graduation date was outed, I'll just out some of my disclosures here. I'm an employee of Merck & Company, voluntary staff at HMH and the VA Medical Center. Used to be at HHS, but really these views are my own. So please view, they're obviously shaped by these experiences, but truly these are my own perspectives. So, class of 1984. So I was a precocious little kid. I was that sort of bratty kid who was kind of reciting his times tables in the 4th grade when I was 4 years old. Wasn't very well liked by my classmates. And was really taken by the idea of a career in medicine. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is I had some early healthcare experiences. 2, I was an Indian American immigrant, so it's a risk factor for becoming a physician. Just ask Dr. Shah. Just ask your colleagues at the hospital. And really I was very much sold on this notion of a win-win interaction between physicians and patients. Through my precocious 4- and 5-year-old eyes, I would look at sort of other professions and I would say, that some of these professions involve taking from others in order to sort of succeed personally. And in medicine, we have this sort of special gift, this special opportunity to actually participate in a win-win interaction with our patients. And I think if we all look inside our own experiences, that probably is what led us to this profession in the first place. And I also, of course, had this desire to win the affection of my parents, which I still haven't won. So then, there was the example of my father. And he ended up being, I think, a very important force in my career decision-making. He was an academic anesthesiologist at Sloan Kettering, was really sort of taken with the idea of sort of innovating techniques. He was a pain management physician before that profession had really exploded. Most of my childhood was spent, we didn't actually go on family vacations. Typically, we went to medical conferences, and I would sort of watch my dad present, and then we would extend it by 1 or 2 days. I see some familiar looks. I see some looks of recognition in the audience. And the amazing thing about my dad's experience that I think really was important to my own decision to go into medicine as a career was that he was always satisfied. He was always happy. He would come home and he would tell me stories about something that he did. Whether it was a CT-guided, neurolysis of this, that, or the next thing. It was something that he was proud of. And I would occasionally get the opportunity to actually go to the hospital, see how he interacted with his colleagues, see how he interacted with his patients, and there was sort of, a real collegiality and a real gratitude. And in the course of doing an internship or 2 at Sloan Kettering, it just felt like the hospital was home. And I think a lot of you have probably had very similar experiences in choosing this really wonderful profession that we're a part of. I also had another very important influence growing up, and this one was a little bit sort of, I think, more at a distance. This is a picture of my aunt, Shanti Jain, who has since passed away, but she was an Indian woman physician in the 1950s, a real rarity, and decided not to get married and committed herself completely to rural healthcare. She wanted to go back to our ancestral community, take care of people who otherwise didn't have access to care. She started a school, she started a leprosy rehabilitation center, and she really kind of was this larger-than-life figure in our family. She was the person who was really making a difference. She was somebody who was totally committed to service. She was a physician citizen. And this notion of physician citizen was sort of the image of what it meant to be a doctor for me. And so when I went to college, I wasn't going to be a biology major. I was going to be a government major. I was going to study healthcare policy, and I was going to start to take on these questions that my dad had no interest in, which is, why don't people have access to care? Why do we have problems in quality of care? And I, too, was going to be a physician citizen really in the image of my aunt, and work in social service and work in public service, and really try to make healthcare better for as many people as I possibly could. And so I went to college at Harvard. I got exposed to a number of sort of really leading health policy analysts and figures. Some of these folks might be sort of recognizable to you. This is really sort of an image of a lot of my mentors: Michael Porter, David Blumenthal, Don Berwick, Howard Hyatt. I was very lucky. I was very lucky to get some great teachers who took a personal interest in me and really taught me a lot about healthcare policy, really from an early age. But in that education arose for me a very, very troubling narrative, and I started to have really a crisis of confidence in my own career decision making, in my own thinking about what I wanted to do, in my own thinking about what it really means to be a physician in American society in 2014, or in this case it was 2002 or 2001. If you look at all the problems we have in healthcare, whether it's access or cost or quality or disparities, there's a narrative that emerges that physicians are the source of the problem and not necessarily the solution to the problem. And so if you think about access, you think about the cost of care and physicians as a role in actually sort of driving up healthcare costs. And you think about quality, and you think about the sort of new recognition over the past 20 years that healthcare quality is as bad as it is, and the role that we actually play in contributing to those problems. And if you think about the disparities in care and the role of individual physicians in actually contributing to disparities, it actually created for me, again, really a crisis of confidence about my own decisions about this profession and my own decisions about really how I wanted to make my contributions going forward. And so I was actually very lucky to come across a paper somewhere in my training by Deborah Stone about this concept of causal stories, which I think is just such an important idea, and I'll spend a little time kind of unpacking it for us as a group. So the notion of causal stories really comes from the idea that complex problems actually don't have sort of simple solutions, but that in the public imagination, we start to create simple solutions, that there's actually a battle for the public narrative around what causes what and how it actually, how our problems actually come to be in society. And so different groups in the healthcare system, different groups in society engage in sort of a battle to actually control the narrative around what causes what. And if you start thinking about causal stories as it relates to our problems in healthcare, you can see how we've really been on the sidelines as a profession and actually shaping the causal stories around what is causing our problems in American healthcare delivery. And actually, when I was in the federal government at CMS and at ONC, I saw really upfront how these causal stories were playing out. Well, the problems with health information technology are really the vendors, or the problem with health information technology are really the doctors. The problems in health information technology are the hospitals, and so on and so forth. And you could basically see this playing out every day in sort of interest group politics and how the public starts to view the source of our problems. I was also lucky to be able to read as a freshman in college. If anyone ever questions the value of a liberal arts education, this is sort of my defense of it. I read this sort of obscure paper, which was Motivation, Agency, and Public Policy of Knights, Knaves, Pawns, and Queens. It had nothing. I thought it had to do with chess. It had nothing to do with chess. In fact, it was about public policy and sort of human motivation and how we actually view human motivation and how our view of human motivation influences our view of public policy and our view of regulation. And so if you take the view that humans are fundamentally altruistic and that we really care about each other, then what you want from public policy is to encourage and support this altruism. That's the goal of public policy, if you actually take the view that human beings are altruistic. If you take the view that human beings are really just out for themselves, then what you really want to do is protect against vice, that you actually want to protect people from each other, and that's the role of public policy and the role of regulation. And finally, if you take the view that people are really just pawns and they just kind of respond to whatever incentives they're given, then you kind of want to decide on what your social aims are and then sort of proceed accordingly. And Legrand, when he wrote about this, wasn't thinking about healthcare. He was actually just thinking about public policy and social policy in post-World War II. But when I read this paper again several years later, it occurred to me that this sort of framework might actually shape our dialogue about the medical profession. And we could start to ask this question: are physicians knights? Do we really just care about each other? Are we knaves, self-interested, really just out to make a buck? Or are we pawns and we just kind of do what's demanded of us by insurance companies or others? And so I want to unpack this view of physicians as knights, knaves, and pawns, because I think you'll start to see some threads that you've probably dealt with over the course of change in how our profession is viewed. So if you think about physicians as knights, then we're trusted to actually manage resources. We're trusted to look at our patients, manage their interests. We should be given highest priority in terms of our autonomy and our decision making, and ultimately the structure of our work should be to actually support us as physicians. And really the motivation for us to practice medicine is to save and improve lives, and financial gain is not a real driver of what we're doing. We're primarily in practice to actually take care of others. That's the view of physicians as knights. If you take the view of physicians as knaves, and I struggled with the picture here. I didn't know which one to use. He's sort of a knavish character, so we'll go with it. If you take the view that physicians are knaves, then really we're just like anybody else. We're out to make a buck. We're out for ourselves. The reason we go to 10 years of, 8 years of undergrad and med school and 3 to 6 years of residency and fellowship is because it sort of maximizes our net present value, and that's what we're there for. Policy management education efforts are really meant to combat physicians. Really, if left to our own devices, we would order more tests than we needed to, and just because it would line our pockets, and that ultimately we need a complex system of carrots and sticks to get physicians to really sort of not engage in abuse or fraud in the system, and that the only reason that physicians really learn or engage in lifelong learning is primarily to sort of advance our financial ends and not really to take care of patients. And if you take the view that we're pawns, then we just kind of do whatever others ask us to do, and we're not that thoughtful about it. We don't really have a lot of agency. And you can imagine sort of how some parts of the healthcare system really view us that way. And so I think that we used to be knights, and I think there's a couple of kind of key pieces of data that support the notion that we're knights. And it's the trust that the public really put in us, through, as seen through a couple of kind of key ideas. The first is how we were paid. We used to be sort of paid a fraction of what we billed, and we were trusted to bill what we were supposed to bill, and that's how we were paid. If you think about quality, quality was assumed. Everyone thought that their doctor was great, that we actually really all provide very good care, and if there's a quality problem, it's a bad apple problem, not a problem that is endemic to the profession or to the system. And then my favorite is licensure and board certification. You would actually sort of take a test once to prove your competency, and then it was assumed that you were going to be a lifelong learner. How many times have we heard the expression, physician is a lifelong learning profession? We would just do this. And we would do it because it was the right thing to do, not because anyone asked us to do it, not because it was required of us. It was just what we would do because we are professionals. Now let's look at kind of the current framework that we operate in. Payment policy is really about carrots and sticks, right? You have pay-for-performance programs that sort of demand that you do this in order to get paid that, because you wouldn't do it on your own, right? There's an implicit message in that. If you think about quality management, we now sort of have instead of the assumption that most care is good, we have the assumption that most care is bad. Nurses feel like they need to protect patients from doctors. Patients feel like they need to protect patients from doctors. Family members feel like they need to protect patients from doctors. That's the kind of common narrative that I think a lot of us operate in. One of my kind of funny moments from my clinical training was really sort of towards the end, where I scratched my head one day and I said, when I went into this field, I really thought that I would be dealing with lots of really grateful patients, but I can count on my hand, 2 or 3 patients who actually ever really said thank you in sort of a deep or sincere way. It was kind of a shock to my system to actually sort of realize that my image of what the profession would be and what it actually had become were very different. And then finally, in licensure and board certification, and my co-author on this paper is Chris Castle, and I like to beat up on her about this. This whole notion of maintenance of certification, the idea that we need to actually sort of recertify because we wouldn't study on our own. We wouldn't actually learn the things we need to learn to take care of our patients without sort of a board certifying body charging us $2,000 to maintain our certification every 10 years, right? That's sort of the current framework in which we operate. So I think there's good data to suggest that we've actually switched from a physicians as knights kind of view of the world to a physicians as pawns or knaves view of the world. And to me, it's actually quite problematic. And I think it's the fundamental question that underlies the soul of our profession and what I think should be a real focus of medical education going forward. I don't want to sort of leave you with the thought that this knights, knaves, or pawns framework only applies to physicians. I've actually written about it now about patients. There's a JAMA commentary on that. I've written about it on health plans and pharmaceutical companies, nurses, and hospital executives, those don't get quite as much attention. But the point is that I think that there is a battle for who's good and who's bad, in sort of very simple terms, in our public discourse about the different stakeholders in the healthcare system. And the right answer is no one's good and no one's bad, right? But there is something different about being a medical professional that I think we need to hold on to, that's very important, because I think that there's some problems with what's happening right now. The first is that I think there's the argument that physicians are knaves or pawns is an argument of convenience. And if you actually talk to real patients, people who really access the healthcare system, who have real connections with their doctors, most of them are actually really appreciative and actually do recognize the value of the care that we provide. We as a profession have not owned self-regulation. We've actually given it away. And the best example of this, I would say, is 10 or 15 years ago when I was in medical school, one of the efforts that I led was an initiative to try to get health policy incorporated into our curriculum. And the medical educators that I was sort of making this argument to laughed at me. They said, we've got all this stuff that we need to teach you guys, and there isn't really time for health policy in our curriculum. And so what happens is you create a group of people who largely don't know what they don't know, and then are then subject to what they don't know, and then honestly feel victimized by what they don't know. And so we don't actually take on the leadership role that we can in actually shaping the healthcare delivery system, because we've never seen it as our responsibility. I think, we are living in relative ignorance. I mean, one of the reasons I studied healthcare policy as an undergraduate is because when I would talk to my dad about it, he said, I don't really care about that stuff. I was very curious about it. But, it was totally acceptable 20, 30 years ago to say, what, my job is to take care of patients and not worry about anything else. Well, I think as a profession, some of us need to care about these things. And we need to have our voice heard. What I'll tell you is when I was at ONC, I was responsible for a lot of stakeholder engagement initiatives, and I never got a phone call from a single physician in the community. I can count, I can say I got one letter from one physician in the community about the meaningful use regulations. The rest of it was all interest groups and all big picture stakeholder groups, but never from an individual physician saying, this is what I think this is. And had I received a letter like that, it would have been a very powerful one, because it would have actually been an authentic physician's voice instead of some large interest group actually participating in the discourse. Really, despite being under siege for a long time right now, really long time now, we haven't organized in any meaningful way to actually defend against this and reshape the profession. If you think about Deborah Stone's sort of notion of causal stories and actually shaping the perspective on our profession, where are we with this? What are we doing to proactively manage this? We frankly are acting like pawns and acting like knaves to a lesser extent when it comes to really responding to these things. You put up a funding opportunity announcement, we apply for it. Where are we actually proactively shaping what that funding opportunity announcement should look like? We're not there. And I think that there's a lot of public discomfort with the physicians as knaves approach and the physicians as pawns approach. And you start to see it in many different places. So, high tech, one of the kind of sort of sad articles that came out in the post-high tech era was this notion of physicians using EMR systems to upcode because they could. And that sort of story got a lot of traction in terms of the EMR adoption narrative. Pay for performance programs not actually having a real effect. I think this notion that you can pay us what to do, but it doesn't necessarily move the needle at all. And then lots of evidence of fraud and abuse that comes from this sort of pay for performance world, where you have a group of Ohio cardiologists cathing a bunch of healthy people in order to juke their numbers, to quote The Wire. So I think the current dialogue really misses the mark. And so, I think we have to change how we think about ourselves, and we have to organize differently, and we have to say, maybe pay for performance isn't the right answer. Maybe, clinical outcomes are not produced by individual physicians, but they're actually produced by systems and teams, and maybe you need to start thinking about rewarding systems and teams instead of, looking at individual physicians. And then we have to sort of re-win this argument that we're different and that we actually have some intrinsic motivation to do the right thing. One of the most interesting things I've read in the past year was a book called The Billionaire's Apprentice, which is about greed and management consulting and hedge funds. It's really a page turner if you get the chance to read it. But the part that's sort of relevant here is actually the sort of description of management consulting. Management consultants don't get paid differently based on whether their clients do better or worse. They get paid as a profession. They get paid a fixed fee because the idea is you don't want the results to be influenced. You don't want the answer to be influenced by some answer that in which the management consultant maybe has a financial interest. And so they're paid, on a piecewise basis, for their work. And they're trusted to produce the right answer because that's what they do. And they are a profession that is built on sort of repeat business. And so the notion that we need to be paid on a piecewise basis, that we need to be sort of paid to do the right thing, I think has really eroded our sense of professionalism. It's eroded the public's appreciation and respect for the role that we actually play in society. And I think Legrand actually has a very important caveat that's worth mentioning, which is that if you actually treat knaves like they're knights, you actually have real disaster follows. But even greater disaster follows if you treat people who are altruists like they are knaves. Because if you treat people who are altruists like they're knaves, eventually they'll start to behave like knaves because that's what's sort of expected of them. And I do think that that's largely the story of what's happened with our profession over the past several decades. And so, I think the literature on human motivation and sort of behavioral economics has a lot to teach us here, which is that, the notion of actually paying people for things that they would do anyway actually erodes their will to do it. And that, in fact, what we need to do is reward people's intrinsic motivation and find non-financial ways to honor them. One of the, sort of another memorable kind of anecdote from my clinical friend to me and said, it's kind of a shame that you don't know if you've done a good job in residency unless they name you chief resident. That's literally, and I thought about it. And I thought about sort of some of my other experiences in business and management and the notion of 360 feedback. If you're a McKinsey consultant, you get feedback from your engagement manager every Friday. It's Feedback Friday, and they tell you what you're doing well, they tell you what you're doing poorly, they give you some sense of your holistic development. Who does that in medical education? What happens is you graduate, you're either chief resident, you're not, and you go on to fellowship, and then you graduate or you don't. So, the point is that I think that there's ways in which we can imbue our profession with sort of more, I think more of a soul, to be very frank, by actually rewarding people for doing a good job, for actually having that sort of positive interaction with patients and positive interactions with colleagues. Instead, we have turned our work into piecewise work. And people will blame the 80-hour work week for that, but I think there's something much more fundamental and much more basic about it, which is really our professional culture. And so, some ideas for medical education. I think one is to really acknowledge the issues and make them a part of our professional dialogue. We like to sort of focus on the clinical and basic science and ignore the rest. I think that's had important and sort of deep implications for how we've operated as a profession that have hurt us in the long run. I think it's important for us to talk about how we're paid. It's important for us to talk about how we'd like to be paid. And it's important for us to actually lead that dialogue as opposed to just simply being subject to it. I think that we need to really invest in models of training that preserve and honor humanism, and I really mean honor it, identify it, hold it up. I can't think of an example of, I've seen so many acts of kindness that I've, on behalf of my colleagues, that have never been sort of held up and said, wow, this is an amazing thing that happened. So we need to honor people more, I think, as individuals, and honor these sort of basic acts of humanism, because if we don't honor them, they do go away over time. That's the reality of, I think, human motivation. I think we need to find ways to make it easy for patients, for physicians to do the right things for patients. I don't think most of us are actually sort of motivated by financial ends. I think most of us are motivated by doing right for patients. But sometimes the systems make it so hard for us to do the right things for patients. And we don't actually do a lot for ourselves in actually making our systems easier by holding them up to people like Nirav and people like the heads of Blue Cross Blue Shield of New York or whoever is getting in the way of doing the right things for patients. We need to call it out and engage in a productive dialogue. Having sat in a couple of these positions, I really don't see a lot of incoming from the people who largely complain about these things. And I think we need to start thinking about paying physicians differently. The notion of pay for performance is really, I think, the wrong idea. And I say this as somebody who worked at WellPoint helping to develop pay for performance programs. It sounded like the right idea in 2005. But what it does is it actually erodes our professionalism and makes us feel more like piece workers who need to check boxes instead of real professionals. And we need to start to assume quality a little bit more while also measuring it and making sure that we're accountable. And I think there's a very careful balance between the hysteria around measurement, which I think is important and valuable, but also preserving our professionalism and making sure that we do hold ourselves to high standards because it's the right thing to do, not because the state is checking on us or because we're not going to achieve X, Y, or Z bonus. I think the measurement bodies, organizations like the NQF and the payers need to really focus on measures that are clinically meaningful. I don't think people should be dinged for lipids at LDLs of 104 instead of 99. So I think we need to start to get a little bit rational about how we actually think about measuring clinical quality and take a view of outcomes as opposed to sort of specific data points. And then I just want to, because of what we're all here to talk about today, I really want to zero in on this issue of training physicians in new competencies that incorporate leadership and advocacy. I think these ideas are totally missing, and if they exist in small chunks of curriculum. They exist in a small course that the hidden curriculum tells us is not really as valuable as other parts of the curriculum, and we need to act as role models for young physicians to show them that we can actually change healthcare delivery by working together. And I think this demonstration project is an extraordinary example of that, and I think all of you should be honored for that. I think it's an important step forward. I was telling Foster, when I first got here, that if we had a meeting like this 10 years ago, there'd be 5 people here. And it's amazing that this room is as full as it is, and that people are, I think, are innovating as much as they are. And so, I think if we can engage in counter-narrative building, if we can start to tell a story of a medical profession that's actually leading change as opposed to reacting to change, I think we can inspire a next generation of young people to really try to make a difference and really restore us to our knightly position, because I think that is what leads people to do this profession. It's what keeps us in this profession. And there are too many people feeling sort of abused and feeling down about being a physician. And I think it's one of the most important professions we have in our society, and we need to start owning that role instead of running away from it. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and hope I'll engage in some dialogue with you all today. Thanks a lot.
So we have some time, and Dr. Jane has agreed to take some questions. So we have some mics in the back, and some folks will come around if you want to raise your hand. Thank you so much for that presentation. Just raise your hand and we'll get to you. While folks are mustering up their courage, I had a question, which is, have you seen examples in which the kinds of changes that you're talking about with respect to professionalism, can you comment on its relationship to organizational success, however you measure it? Improved outcomes, improved financial success? Is there anything to learn from institutions, healthcare organizations around the country about the importance of this relative to things that matter in the C-suite?
Yeah, no, so one of my one of the business school case studies that I've written is on MD Anderson Cancer Center. And the very interesting thing about MD Anderson is they actually are entirely salary-based. There's a small volume component to people's compensation, but it's mostly salary-based compensation. And so what you do see is a lot of examples of cross-institutional, cross-disciplinary collaboration that doesn't happen in other environments that I think would happen because of that. So I think that salary-based compensation actually meaningfully changes people's people's willingness to work together. But it has to sort of be supported by a strong professional culture. I think culture eats strategy, 200 times a week. So.
Hi. I can talk loud. I just am curious about your thoughts on how to organize. I think us organizing is key to the success of any sort of endeavor that we do, but how to make that happen? How do we organize sort of within our institutions and then on a broader level so that we can actually have enough force to have our voices heard and to start to do the work that I think is what you detailed and how important it is.
I'll be really granular about it. So if I were at sort of your institution, I would be heckling the media relations person to tell the story about your demonstration projects, because the New York Times should be writing a special series on it, instead, in addition to the special series that they're doing right now on costs of care. So one of the things that I'm in a hospital environment, I'm seen as like incredibly outgoing. I was seen as downright shy and sort of reclusive when I was in the government. And it was, I think there's sort of a cultural thing in medicine where it's kind of like we put our heads down and we do our work, and that's sort of what we do as a profession. But I think sort of getting that story out there, getting that narrative out there, is something that people in other industries get. They know how to do it. They know how to write a press release. They know how to put the story out there. One activity, we could clear half an hour of your schedule today. You could all write press releases about your activities and just bombard, the New York Times with stories about what you're all doing. And that's how I would start thinking about this, in a very sort of granular and tactical way.
Many of my years in my career were spent at a medical school, and one of the things I've seen, and I want to know how you might address the cost of medical education, which is the elephant in the room, tends to drive new graduates into professions that are away from primary care, and also their desire to make a living to compensate. So if that isn't figured in as part of the solution, how will it change?
I think there's a lot of important policy work that needs to be done to, sort of decrease the cost of medical education for people who choose lesser paying specialties. I think there needs to be important work done on sort of recalibrating how specialties are paid. But one of the sort of things we could start doing today is talking about it. So we have this professional culture where, the first time anyone talks about negotiating a salary or a job is when you're going to interview for one. And so one of the things I do for recent program graduates from my own residency is they all come to me to talk about how do I negotiate a job, because I've done it 3 or 4 times more than they have. And so there's something that I think we don't actually do. We do ourselves a huge disservice by not talking about it. So from your very first day in medical school, you can say these are the salary charts. This is what you make if you do this. This is what you make if you do this. These are the choices you're going to have to make. These are the limits in which you're going to have to live. Instead, we pretend like it doesn't matter, which isn't true, right? You get to the end of the road and you've got fixed expenses, you've got a mortgage, you've got 2 kids, you've got whatever loans you have to repay in addition to whatever childcare costs you have. Let's talk about it. It's literally completely absent until the very, very end. So I would say we need to start having a more authentic dialogue about what we're choosing when we choose things. Otherwise, I think people do end up in this very bitter place where they say, I chose primary care, but I had no idea that I was going to be paid $94,000 to be a pediatrician in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a conversation that I've had. So I think we need to really talk about this and help people make choices. To that point, we have a professional culture, just to finish, we have a professional culture where we shame people for talking about it, where we almost make them feel bad for acknowledging some real human need that they may feel. And I think that that's a big culture change that needs to happen. Well, we can't pretend that it doesn't pay the $94,000 a year. So I mean, I think those structural fixes are really, really important. But the biggest, I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is really not even in talking about it.
Around the professionalism question, it seems like a group of peers with whom you interact who can say, essentially, we can do better than this, is really important. You get it around group practices, but there aren't around high-minded, well-run group practices, like the Geisingers of the world. But the organization of physicians seems like it's a rate-limiting step there, because there's so many in solo practice, or there's so many in employed situations where you don't have that kind of cadre of people you can bounce things off of and get the positive professional feedback that you would need. How do you get there?
So, you know, I think we've all seen the data that solo practice is kind of shrinking. It's going away. You know, I think, you know, ultimately, the whole notion that we need to sort of support each other in our professional development is not something that is part of any residency that I've seen. So I think part of what we need to do is teach it. We don't, you know, the notion of even professional audit and actually looking at each other's work and reviewing each other's cases is something that we could easily implement in residency, you know, right now as part of our professional education. But again, we don't do that. So I think there is a real role for medical education in actually transforming the culture of the profession around that. Instead, what we say is, you know, I've seen examples of where payers have said, oh, we'll pay people to do this kind of work. In part because we say we need to be paid to do that kind of work. And so there is this chicken or the egg problem where we need to kind of, I think, bolster our professionalism through sort of these norms. And then we also need to engage productively with payers to actually get them to support us to do those things.
One last question. Go ahead, Neil.
So there are knights among us and knaves among us. The knights need to be treated like knights, and the knaves need to be treated like knaves. How do we tell the two apart?
So I think that responsibility might went off. Maybe a good time for it to go off. No. I think that there's I think we own that responsibility. And so, you know, one of the things that I find most concerning about our culture in medical education is the 99% graduation rate issue that we don't talk about. We have bad apples among us, and we know that we have bad apples among us, but we do very little to actually call them out because of legal concerns or because we, you know, whatever may follow from actually doing it. But you know, we've all had that medical student in our service where you say, oh my God, this person will hurt someone one day. And I write it into my evaluation, and then 2 years later I see the person's graduated and they've matched really, really well. And it's like one of the weirdest things. Some of it is, you know, how often do people get fired in our profession for doing things that are really out of bounds? We protect each other. We shield each other from these things. And you know, I think the way in which we actually all get treated like knights is if we self-regulate a little bit. But instead, you know, the New York Times is regulating us instead of, you know, us regulating ourselves.